From the American Neurological Association, I'm Adeline Goss. This is ANA Investigates. Recently on the podcast, we've been talking about neurotechnology, devices that interface with the brain to treat disease. For example, by restoring speech function in people with locked-in syndrome or motor function in people with paralyzed limbs. But listen to the media and you'll also hear buzz about neurotechnology for healthy people. Today, we'll talk with Dr. Philip Sabes, neuroscientist and professor emeritus at UCSF. Dr. Sabes co-founded Elon Musk's company Neuralink, which works on implantable brain-computer interfaces. Since leaving Neuralink, Dr. Sabes has continued to work in the neurotech industry. And while his focus is on clinical applications of brain interfacing, he was willing to entertain our questions about how these applications may eventually be adapted to healthy brains. Dr. Sabes spoke with Dr. Rohini Samudralwar of the University of Pennsylvania. Here's Rohini.
Welcome, Philip. Thank you for joining us on this third installment of our series on neurotechnology.
Great to be here. Thanks, Rohini.
Well, you've worked primarily on solving clinical problems through neurotechnology. Some of this has been applied to applications in neurotech outside of the traditional clinical realm. Some of the commercial neurotechnology that is available is targeted at what we might call healthy brains for people who don't have a neurological or psychiatric condition. How do you see neurotechnology evolving for people with these so-called healthy brains?
That's a great question. I think the potential applications for healthy brains in the brain interfacing space broadly writ are big, and it's one of the reasons why there's a lot of commercial interest in this space right now. But I think you have to step back and kind of take it case by case and try to disambiguate where we are, where we can be, and then stuff that's probably just hype at the moment. So I think there's an important distinction to make early on in the discussion, and that's the difference between what I refer to as brain-computer interface, or BCI, and neuromodulation applications of brain interfacing. So with BCI, the goal is to read or write lots of information from the brain. This is, say, for example, for a motor prosthetic device or a sensory prosthesis, like for artificial vision. And here, the ideal device is something that interfaces with lots and lots of neurons, ideally even at the single cell level. For neuromodulation, the goal is to change the patterns of activity across larger brain circuits. That could be to interrupt bad patterns, like, say, for example, those that give rise to central tremor or to interrupt a seizure, or to encourage good patterns, say, for example, to improve mood. And here the goal isn't so much to interact with lots of individual neurons, but rather to get targeted effects in specific brain circuits. So let's start maybe with the BCI side. There, right now we're in a really good place. We know these devices will work if we could get them into brains, but it's the device that's missing. Once those devices are available, you will see paralyzed individuals using them, say, again, to control computers or as a speech prosthesis. Now, how do you go from that to healthy brains? On the BCI side, I think there's still a fairly long path to be had. You can imagine scenarios like it would be kind of cool to be able to control your phone or get text input, but the devices that companies are making are still highly invasive devices that require surgery, and that's probably not the path that people want to go just to be able to control their phone. I think the path from the clinic to healthy brains in BCI, you're really just taking a longer view there. On the neuromodulation side, it's a little bit of a different story, and that's because it's possible to modulate neural activity through non-invasive techniques. Now, there are a lot of companies that have come up over the past decade or so that use, say, for example, transcranial direct current stimulation. That's basically like hooking a 9-volt battery up to your brain, or even transcranial AC, alternating current, that people have marketed for healthy brains for things like focus and other things. I haven't seen any terribly compelling demonstrations yet in that space, so I think we're not quite there. And part of it might be that those technologies are still pretty limited. They don't have the kind of precision spatially or temporally that you probably need to be able to get the benefit that I dream of when I think about the potential of the neuromodulation space. So for the moment, at least, I think the applications in neuromodulation are still really focused on the clinic. But that said, I do think that there's a path here. So let me give you an example. Transcranial ultrasound is an emerging technology that's potentially very exciting. Ultrasound can activate neural activity, say in vitro. You can take an focused ultrasound transducer and sonicate some cells that are sitting there in culture, and you can drive activity in them. And this is something that's been studied intently only really for the last, say, like 5 or 6 years. And the mechanism of action appears to largely be that you're opening mechanosensitive ion channels. And people have demonstrated, for example, that with this technology, you can modulate the motor cortical activity or the projections in the same way that you can with TMS. You can't drive a motor response like you can with TMS, but you can do that kind of neuroplasticity induction that then you can test, say, for example, with TMS. People have also shown that you can change widespread patterns of connectivity in non-human primate and in humans as measured by functional connectivity measures using, say, resting state MRI. So these are the kinds of ingredients that you might need to be able to get clinical applications in a non-invasive way. And there are trials underway right now for changing mood, say for major depression. There are trials underway for sleep, for pain, for a bunch of different potential applications. Now, if we can start learning how to target specific neural circuits in really effective ways with non-invasive or maybe even minimally invasive devices, like say, for example, a device that sits in the skull, then if you had something like that for a particular indication, say, for example, for depression or for pain, but you could use that same device with just a software change to do other kinds of things like, say, for example, just improve your general affect or give you better focus or whatever, then you could imagine people wanting to use their devices for those off-label applications. And so this is a path where you could imagine that over time, once we learn more about how to use these devices effectively, that a bunch of different new applications come up, some of which would likely be targeted to healthy brains, like, for example, focus or mood. And when I think about this, I often think about the from Philip K. Dick's To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. There's this dystopic vision of what he calls the Penfield mood organ, which is this ability to kind of dial up your mood. Okay, well, in the book, it's a bit dystopic, but you can imagine that we could get to a point where people could be able to better control their own state in a way that I think many of us would want to do if we could.
It sounds like from what you're saying, BCI and both neuromodulation in the healthy brain still has a ways to go. I think we all, those of us outside the field, tend to jump to some of these dystopic depictions in media. And so it's helpful to know that the reality of it is that there is still some dedicated work involved in making this truly accessible.
Actually, if I can comment on that just briefly, I think, there's definitely a dystopian potential. I mean, there are lots of ways that these kinds of devices could be used in ways that we wouldn't want to see. And we haven't talked about kind of non-invasive readout EEG devices where a lot of people are talking about the potential misuses of that, say, for example, at the workplace. But when you think about these kind of neuromodulation devices, what encourages me is that they don't yet work at the level that everybody's going to want to just go out and buy them and use them. And I think we may be close, but we're not there yet. And this development time that's required is going to give the field time to think about the implications more and to think about ways to create safeguards. And now is the time to be doing that for people in industry, for academia, and even for people in government to be thinking together about where the field is going and to be prepared when it gets there. I don't think there's need right now to jump in with regulation or to curtail the field, but I think there is need right now to be thinking about where we're going to go and what are the right ways to safeguard individuals and society.
I'm so glad you emphasized that, to establish these safeguards sort of proactively rather than reactively down the line. I agree, it is very, very important, and was something that we touched on, the neuroethical implications of all of this in the first episode of our series here. I did want to touch on another aspect. Some people have forecasted that there might someday be ways to improve cognitive function through these technologies, including for people with no known cognitive issues. Do you think this is actually likely to happen?
There's no reason to believe that in the long term we can't do that. If you can modulate circuits, if you can interface with the brain with high resolution, then there are lots of things that ultimately down the line we can do. That said, we don't really know how to do that right now. I mean, there are, for example, cases where people have shown improvements in attention with non-invasive brain stimulation, for example. But when you think about the kind of improvement of cognition that you're talking about, we don't really understand at this point how high-level cognition works. In other words, what would somebody want? Somebody might want to be, smarter, sharper, faster, but we don't really know what in the brain makes you smart, sharp, and fast. And so there isn't really a pathway yet for that. I mean, people have ideas. For example, a lot of people think about, including myself, that working memory seems to be a bottleneck when you're working on complex problems, so a high-level cognition bottleneck. So might there be a way to improve your working memory? There might be, but as far as I know, no one's really, I mean, there are kind of exercises that people can do, but in terms of understanding the mechanisms of working memory well enough to be able to go in and double your digit span or something like that, no one knows how to do that. Attention and focus are probably the area where there's most traction. And this does dovetail in with mood. I think everybody would agree that their ability to focus, their kind of sharpness, varies with some kind of general state that we might lump into as mood. And there again, I think we're closer. If we had these kinds of tools that would let us try out modulating different circuits in a safe way, then I think we would probably find applications like that over time. And so that's probably the area where we're closest.
Great. I want to switch gears momentarily to AI, a type of technology that is currently available. Recently, there's been a lot of public discussion around language-based artificial intelligence, for example, ChatGPT. A lot of this discussion is centered around its utility or even exploitation in writing materials that humans would otherwise be writing. I know AI is not your area of research, but I wonder if you see ways that this type of technology might help inform our understanding of the human brain.
Yeah, the answer is yes, absolutely. Let me back up for 1 second. There's kind of a weird thing in the field where I think in popular press, sometimes brain interfacing and AI get conflated a little bit in conversations. And I think that the two fields have a lot in common, but they're very different fields. There are many opportunities where AI can help in brain interfacing. And the most obvious one, as you mentioned, is in the realm of speech. So we have these really great large language models that are able to predict speech in a kind of uncannily good way. And so if we had devices that were available now that you could put into speech-related motor cortex, for example, I think you'd be able to create a really great speech prosthesis. And then more generally, these kinds of algorithms, I think, will be extremely useful. AI in general will be extremely useful for the decoding problem. How do you take neural information from the brain and use it to predict what somebody's thinking? And because we don't have these devices in people, we don't have a lot of data yet on neural data combined with behavioral data at scale. We don't know all the many different ways in which this could be useful. But I suspect that once Neuralink and other companies are out there in the field, we'll find that there are many, many such applications, and that these models will prove to be exceptionally powerful, even at the individual level, because maybe relatively little data will be needed to be able to get really good predictive power. Then I guess the last thing I would mention is one of the big challenges is how to close the loop, how to record activity and then make decisions on the fly in order to determine how the device should stimulate the brain. If you think about, go back to that example I gave of ultrasound neuromodulation, one of the advantages of ultrasound is that it's steerable. The other is that it can go deep into the brain. And so with software, you can just steer around where you want to be in the brain, but that's a big parameter space. So how do you find the optimal spot, and how do you continually update over time to always refine on the fly? Partly because the parameter space is big, so it will take a long time to find the right spot, and also because depending on state, depending on habituation, other things, that spot may move. And so the ability to function autonomously and continually to optimize therapy is another area where AI algorithms could play a really big role in making very powerful therapeutics available to individuals.
It sounds like it's adding a level of precision medicine to AI and perhaps even BCI.
Exactly, that's right. Yeah.
Well, what do you think are the most exciting areas of BCI research right now? You've touched on so many different exciting new trials and research being done. What has been on your mind lately? And for example, for a researcher just entering this field, what should they be looking out for?
Well, those are two different questions. In terms of researchers entering the field, oh my gosh, there's so much. It's such an exciting time right now. There are basic science questions that feed into everything we've been talking about, like how do you stimulate brain areas that don't have a simple topographic map? So, a cochlear implant works because the cochlea has a tonotopic map, and that's the principle that cortical prosthesis, say for visual or auditory, the input would work on. But a lot of the information that we might want to write into the brain, it lives in areas that don't have a nice topography and where there are complex dynamics. So what does it look like to stimulate into higher order brain areas? What I've been thinking a lot about is more on the neuromodulation side, similar themes, but the past few decades has been just an extraordinary period of time in basic neuroscience. The ability to study circuits with genetic dissection. So circuit neuroscience has really taken off, and we know so much, at least about the rodent brain, that we didn't know before at the broad brain-wide circuit level. And once that information becomes available, it just begs the question of how could you go in and modulate those circuits for clinical benefit? For clinicians, one of the advantages that clinicians have is not only do they understand the basic neuroscience of the circuits, but they have such deeper insight into the ways in which dysfunction of those circuits plays out in people's lives. And so, again, this is an area where I think clinicians could play a really big role in helping to identify, biomarkers for successful interventions and helping to identify circuits and patient populations that would be well served by devices like this. So, it's a really exciting time. And I know me personally, as I'm ramping up on a new effort in this space, would love to hear from clinicians who think that they have interesting potential applications. And I think that's true for many people working in the field.
Thank you, Philip. I really enjoyed speaking with you today, and especially discussing the current state and potential of neurotechnology. I am sure that you've also inspired several of our early career listeners here today. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, Rohini.
That was Dr. Philip Sabes, Professor Emeritus at UCSF, interviewed by Dr. Rohini Samudralwar of the University of Pennsylvania. ANA Investigates is the official podcast of the American Neurological Association. The show's producers are members of the ANA Education Innovation Committee, chaired by Megan Ritchie. I'm Adeline Goss, podcast host and executive producer. Our program was produced today by Rohini Samudralwar, Mandy Hagalino-Cole, and me, with help from Jen Hurley. You can access past episodes of the show and all of the ANA's educational programs at myana.org. That's it for ANA Investigates. See you next month.